suburbs. Almost as much written about as Madison Avenue. And just as much in need of reflection. It takes a while for a young couple to realize all they're in for when they buy a house. Or when they have a baby. And when they buy a house and have a baby. So hardly realizing it, they come into their purchasing stage and are off on a wild, non-stop ride. It's a happy-go-spending world, reflected in the windows of the suburban shopping centers where they go to buy. The shopping centers see these young adults as people whose homes are always in need of expansion. People who buy in large quantities and truck it away in their cars. It's a big market. These young adults, shopping with the same determination that led them to the suburbs in the first place, are the goingest part of a nation on wheels, living by the automobile. The first young adults in the age of the push button.
Americans, by and large, love suburbia. It has promised space, affordability, convenience, family life, and upward mobility. After half a century of constant development, more than half our population has moved here. And as the population of suburban sprawl has exploded, so too the suburban way of life has become embedded in the American consciousness. Suburbia and all it promises has become the American dream. But as we enter the 21st century, serious questions are emerging about the sustainability of this way of life. Does the suburban dream have a future?
The whole suburban project, I think, can be summarized pretty succinctly as the greatest misallocation of resources in the history of the world. America took all of its post-war wealth and invested it in a living arrangement that has no future.
The basic cause of it all is the end of cheap and abundant energy.
Cheap oil is the party that we've been enjoying for the past 150 years. And that party is coming to an end. Within our lifetimes, we're going to see the end of the age of oil. And the result of that will be the end of the American way of life.
Here, in a typical North American suburb, life seems to be carrying on much as it has for the past 50 years. With every passing year, more and more streets like this one replace farmers' fields as more and more people come here for their share of the good life. History, however, has proven itself indifferent to people's hopes and dreams for a better life. Even the best of intentions have often not been enough to avoid calamity. And suburbia began with the best of intentions.
The dream of the suburbs was the antidote to city life, and in particular, the life of the industrial city and the industrial town. And the antidote was going to be country living for everybody. And the suburbs was a way of delivering that to the masses. The industrial city and the industrial town were really things that had never been seen before. You know, they were new. Human beings didn't have experience with them and with all the terrible things that they produced. So, you know, the towns and cities of North America grew up in tandem with the industrial processes and were very much products of industrialism. And what happens pretty early in the process, by the mid-19th century, is that the industrial city becomes a fairly horrible place. this idea establishes itself in, I think, the collective consciousness of all of us North Americans that the city is not really a very good place to live. And what is the alternative? Well, there's the city and there's a country. In the 1870s and 80s and 90s, you get the first template, which is the suburb based on the idea of the manor in a park, the estate in a park. And these are subdivisions like Llewellyn Park in New Jersey and Riverside, 9 miles outside the Chicago Loop, which are basically large Victorian villas deployed in a park-like setting. In the beginning, there must have been elements of it that were lovely, because the first people who were moving out there were pretty well off. And they were moving to real countryside. There were no Kmarts in 1897. Then in the late 19th, early 20th century, before World War I, you get something quite different. You get the streetcar suburb, which is based on this idea of the streetcar lines now leaving the city, and these new suburbs, which are still fairly civic in their physical design.
And there were these stops, and each one of these stops created a beautiful little main street and smaller, higher density housing, cottages, bungalows nearby, all very walkable in the most traditional sense.
And they are some of the most wonderful neighborhoods in America. They're just outside the central cities. Then what happens is in the 1920s you get the mass motoring democratization of suburbia. And that results in the boom of the 1920s, largely based on creating these automobile suburbs and all of their furnishings and accessories. And that project is interrupted by the Great Depression and the Second World War.
No, sir. All this can't keep a fella from putting down his ideas. Something is going to add up here. Its own air-conditioned castle with a deep freeze. Cooler for beer. Great big lawn where Bet and Pubsy will welcome him home. Veterans Emergency Housing Program is launched to help solve the housing emergency in hundreds of cities. The target, 2,700,000 homes and apartments started by the end of 1947.
Almost overnight, suburbia was born. 500,000 homes sprang up around the country in 1946. Nearly 1 million in 1947. 1 million in 1948. Still more in 1949, 1950. The empty farmlands, the quiet towns and villages surrounding the city found themselves in the midst of a roaring housing boom.
You get the real full elaboration of the automobile suburb based on the idea of the cul-de-sac subdivision, and that becomes the template for how we're going to build things. This is the only part of the world at that time where, plumbers and pipe fitters and sheetrock hangers could own their own home. The middle class is going to go basically from the wino level clear up to, the doctors and the dentists. And everybody will be included.
You'll find a scene like this in nearly every village, town, and city throughout the country. For in the hopes and dreams of everyone, there's a home they can call their own. Home brings a sense of security to a man. Then, to every woman, her home means a setting for gracious living.
And we'll have the living room right in here. And the kitchen right here so we can see the children playing in the yard. And we'll have shrubbery, of course, right along in here. And, oh, darling, it's going to be just perfect.
One of the things that happens is that suburbia ends up being a false promise. The post-war suburbia is not what it promises to be. It's not country living. It's a cartoon of country living and a cartoon of a house. It has none of the amenities of country life, and it has none of the amenities of the town. And in fact, it has all the disadvantages of both. All you really have is a 6-lane highway.
And so it is that all of us in interdependence live independently on wheels.
The idea is that everybody's going to live in a country house. And one of the results of that is that the American cities and towns are absolutely gutted in the period of 1950s, 60s, and 70s.
Increasingly, we are seeing large-scale demolition as the first step in building modern cities. Getting needed space in our cities for modern structures is the only way to meet the competitive force of growing suburban strength.
The American city is decanted into the countryside, and all of its functions soon follow. The shopping, the office, the retail, everything follows.
The growth of suburbs has brought another major problem: getting there and back. Without cars, suburbia wouldn't be possible. But once we live in suburbia, even where there are trains and buses serving the suburbs, most people have to depend on cars. Each year there are more of them. Each year there must be more highways and expressways to take care of them.
Originally, the suburbs were places that developers actually paid for light rail systems and streetcars to go to in order to make the land viable, places to live. GM and Firestone and I think Standard Oil were actually convicted of conspiring to destroy the light rail systems across the United States. They literally bought them up and tore them out so that they could sell GM buses with Firestone wheels run with Standard Oil. Simultaneously, you had the Federal Highway Program.
A Better Highways contest was recently conducted. Purpose? Arouse nationwide thinking on how to plan and pay for the safe and adequate highways we need.
There is this specific American dream that got packaged and sold and subsidized, highly, highly subsidized. So subsidized that to continue it is a deep question of whether we can afford to continue that level of subsidy, and it is unsustainable.
The interstate highways have become continuous bands of suburban development. You could go from Maine to Florida on Interstate 95 and never see open countryside. It's become a continuous city. And the density of population in those areas is extremely low. It's not economic to build railroads, or even bus lines are uneconomic in those vast areas of sprawl because population density is so low. The only efficient way to travel is by individual automobile. Distances people drive are quite considerable. 50, 100 miles a day is not unusual for commuters who live in these outer suburban areas.
The suburbs wouldn't exist if it weren't for cheap oil. The U.S. is a car culture. The automobile industry started in the U.S., and really the automobile industry got its start here because we were looking for ways to use that cheap oil. The U.S. was awash in oil in the early 20th century. In the 1930s, they were discovering the stuff so fast that oil in Texas was cheaper than drinking water by the carload. The car companies quickly became the engine driving U.S. industry and economic growth. The result of this is that we have created this new system of habitation where people live miles and miles from where they work and from where they get their food and all of their other necessities, based on the idea that they can and they must hop in their car at any moment and travel miles and miles. And the only way that works is on the basis of cheap energy.
Now we're stuck up a cul-de-sac in a cement SUV with an empty gas tank.
Everything from our trains and buses, our cars and trucks, our heating in the winter months and cooling in the summer, all are dependent on cheap and reliable fossil fuel energy. And there is no other way of life that uses more of this energy than suburbia. It is cheap and abundant fossil fuels that pave, lubricate, and drive the turbo growth of our suburban development. On and on this way of life expands into farmers' fields, meadows, and hinterland, offering up 6 lanes of the American dream with no end in sight.
We're getting word now from tons of listeners telling us that the power is out. It appears the entire city is now under a massive power outage.
They're doing a free flashlights and water.
Seniors in apartment buildings that they need their air conditioning.
Huge lineup, about 40 people.
The lights are also out in New York City, Pittsburgh, and Detroit.
The fire department showed up about 6 o'clock, rescued people from the elevators.
Public meetings are canceled, and a big chunk of Ontario. This massive blackout is affecting as many as 50 million people at the moment. No idea what's
happening. It's nuts. I feel like I'm in a depression.
What the blackout actually was, it was a whole series of fuse boxes all tripping as we approached 100% capacity. And at the heart of the matter was the fact that we basically had a very mild summer, and on the 14th of August, that was the first day all summer that we were approaching 90-degree temperature at peak, all the way from the eastern shores of Lake Michigan to the Atlantic Ocean, from Toronto, Montreal, Quebec, all the way down to Washington, D.C., Cincinnati, St. Louis. And as we were approaching that, we were clearly getting higher and higher and higher towards the 100% mark because of air conditioning demand. And when are you most vulnerable? You're most vulnerable in peak summer weather between 4 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Because A, that's when weather tends to be the hottest. And B, that's when you have all three users of electricity online at the same time. Industrial, commercial, and residential. So when did the blackout happen? Ironically, 4/13. The question wasn't the event. The question was, why did we ever allow ourselves to get so near peak capacity that it took just a branch or two to end up denying 57 million people light for several days? Everything in society that we cherish ended when the blackout came. And if that wasn't a fire drill for how important energy actually is, I can't imagine it. But you know what? People didn't get it. It wasn't a yellow light. It was a big red light. And I don't think we basically learned a thing from it.
Matthew Simmons is the president and CEO of Simmons & Company in Houston, Texas. It's the world's largest energy investment bank. His clients include the World Bank, Kerr McGee, Halliburton, Bechtel. I mean, he handles the biggest of the big. Matt Simmons was incredibly clear and articulate that, look, folks, we've backed ourselves into the corner. We have committed to natural gas-fired plants. There's really no other alternative. Coal-fired plants are very polluting. Nuclear is way too expensive, and there's too much opposition. And hydroelectric is all used, so we're stuck with gas. But he said there's not going to be any more generating capacity built. Why? Because there's nothing to power the plants with. And who, he asked, would take a 1% return on investment, for $150 million investment in a power generating station if they know there's nothing to power the plant and no way to generate any revenue from it?
We're coming to rely more and more on natural gas for electricity generation, and natural gas is becoming more scarce.
Natural gas is no longer able to be extracted out of the ground at the same colossal rate as it has been to satisfy the enormous hunger and growing demand of North America for natural gas.
Once anyone that knows what they're talking about comes to the realization that natural gas supplies are in decline, then you immediately have to jump to the next consequence. We have to grow electricity, or we will not grow our economy. Because I don't think there is any serious economist that could argue that our economy could grow by 2 to 3% per year and keep electricity use flat.
Economic growth is predicated upon more electricity. Electricity is predicated upon hydrocarbon energy, period. And Matthew Simmons made a very clear statement. He said future growth is not possible. And for a guy from his background to say that was one of the most, that's like the Catholic Church saying the earth is round before Galileo.
Normal for us is using immense amounts of electricity and oil to transport ourselves around. Normal is living in suburbs. Normal is consuming like there's no tomorrow. At some point, we will discover that this normal way of life has come to an end.
The 2003 blackout that denied power to 57 million people has been officially blamed on a falling branch and faulty transmission lines. Matthew Simmons believes that deeper causes exist, that North America is reaching the limits of its generating capacity due to short-sighted energy planning and political hubris. The future of electricity generation in America is being committed to a resource now in decline in America, natural gas. If it is conceivable that such gross mismanagement is leading us into an energy crisis, if it is possible that our policymakers and specialists have made such an historic mistake, what other mistakes might they have made? What have we not been told about the future of oil?
Most people, when they think about oil, think of when we're going to run out. And really that's the wrong question to ask, because oil in the earth is not like oil, gasoline in the gas tank of your car. When your car runs out of gas, then you know there's a problem. But it doesn't run out until you get to the last drops. But with oil in the earth, it's a very different situation. We can't just pump oil out of the earth at any arbitrary rate.
All oil production, whether it's in one oil field or one country or the planet as a whole, always follows a bell curve. When you drill your first well, if the oil's close to the surface under pressure, you get a gusher. You drill more wells, the pressure goes down, the table goes down. But also you're pumping out the light sweet oil, which has risen to the top. The heavier, more expensive oil to refine, the harder to get oil, is obviously way down deep.
And you have to start pumping in water or carbon dioxide or natural gas if you've got some around, and to start forcing the oil out, just as is happening in Saudi Arabia. So what you get is this curve. It starts, pulls up quite quickly, you get more and more and more out, then you reach this peak or plateau.
When you get to about the halfway point, the rate that you can extract the resource peaks. And after that point, no matter how much effort you put into it, you can't continue extracting the resource at the same rate. The rate of extraction peaks and begins to fall.
We're sort of in the middle right now. We're right at the peak. We're at the point where the world is producing the most oil it will ever produce. And we are going to enter the arc of decline very shortly, if not already. It's a little bit unclear whether or not we've actually already entered it.
It's one of these phenomena that you only can say that with phenomenal. Yes, we are sure when you look back in a rearview mirror and say, gosh, obviously we peaked. But usually by the time it's clear, it's so far in the past that you're well into a totally different era.
And once it goes into that decline, it's a permanent kind of a decline. It might be a bumpy decline, and then you've got yourself a gap between what you want to use and what the supply is.
Peaking means categorically that you no longer grow.
The effect of crossing over the peak means, in essence, that every barrel of oil that you produce from that moment on will be more expensive. It will require more energy to get out of the ground, and it'll be a lesser quality of oil.
The only scientists that seem to have taken this really seriously are the old-timers, whereas the young guys are mesmerized by the technology. We created a generation and a half of Nintendo geologists that sit at their workstation and basically move around images until they say, wow, look at that bright spot.
The books on oil have been as cooked as the books at Enron.
In the late 1980s, virtually all of the Arab oil countries reported extraordinary reserve increases of something like 50 to 100% just within a year or two. And this wasn't related to any huge new discoveries. It was mostly political, because OPEC was contemplating new rules at the time that would say that a country could expand its rate of production in oil sales commensurate to its reserves. So there was this incentive to report increased reserves in order to increase market share. But the evidence that oil that has been reported as reserves is actually there is very flimsy. So we don't actually know how much oil is in Saudi Arabia or Iraq, for that matter. Is there 115 billion barrels of oil in Iraq, as is noted in the press again and again? Or could it be 40 billion or 60 billion? We don't really know. Experts like Nat Simmons, the pessimists, are saying that it's probably on the low side. Saudi Arabia may have already peaked.
If it turns out that Saudi Arabia has peaked, then categorically the world has peaked.
The debate over the peaking of oil on the planet has begun. And for the scientists involved, it is not so much a question of if or how, but when.
It's a pleasure for me to open this ASCO seminar. We need to recognize that the issue of the peak oil production is an open-ended debate.
My feeling is that we are going to run into serious trouble by 2010, more or less.
The peak has happened, and now instead of being prophets, we're now historians.
I detect it on many sides now that there is a growing awareness. We've moved beyond asking if there is a peak to ask how big it is, how soon it is, and more than that, what we might do about it. It's no longer sort of the words of some crank in the wilderness. It's becoming, and it has to become, very topical.
Now that we know there's no unused surplus oil in the Middle East, sorry, that's it. And so we probably have passed the Hubbard peak.
I think it's between 2005 and 2007. That's what my model shows.
We always were afraid, what would it be like to live after the Hubbard peak with world oil declining? And I have this list of things. $7 trillion lost out of the U.S. stock market. 2 million jobs lost in the United States. Federal budget surplus gone. State budget surpluses gone. The middle class disappearing.
Peaking is not equivalent to running out. Everyone in the room knows this, but the lack of the people outside this room understanding that that's a serious problem.
I'm sorry to say, really, that the suburban family in America is really going down the wrong path. So what is the impact on the ordinary citizen around? Well, for a few years he can buy another large car. He can smile that there's not a cloud on the horizon. And then the crisis, when it hits, is that much worse. And there's a strange irony in this business, because the more efficient you are in producing the stuff, the more skilled you are, all the good things that one generally sees as positive attributes, the better you are at doing this, all you are really doing is accelerating the depletion and making the situation worse.
The other big squeeze in the suburbs is going to be home heating. And as most homeowners already know, at times that can get expensive. And this last winter, it was particularly wild. We almost ran out of gas in the Northeast. We barely made it, in the sense that the red light lit that says low on fuel.
The United States is reliant for only 15% of its natural gas from Canada. Conversely, the people in the United States are clueless about the fact that that very same 15% is over half of Canada's production. If people in the United States think that that relationship can go on forever, given that natural gas production has just peaked in North America, they're crazy. And we need to adjust in the natural gas realm more rapidly, more aggressively than we do in the oil realm. There are absolutely no quick solutions. Zero.
God does set his own limits. I believe that he likes to test humankind from time to time. And I think the test is going to come very, very soon.
The end of cheap oil and gas is coming. But we have all come to take for granted their benefits. Our affluence in North America, our new cars, our suburban lifestyles, all this is dependent on an abundance of cheap oil and gas. What will be the consequences as fossil fuels become more scarce and more expensive?
We've had this incredible period of 50 years of relative world peace and stability. And I think that it's put the American public into a kind of consensus trance that the world has always been stable, that there's very little relative danger to us in these things that happen around the world, and that we'll probably prevail in the face of all of these things, and that our so-called economy will just keep on chugging along no matter what.
It's in everybody's interest to maintain the facade that this way of life is normal. This is what we should expect. This is what we should expect for our children. And by golly, we should go out and continue buying and consuming like there's no tomorrow.
The economic benefits of living in a very stable world, meaning we're not at war with China, that means that we can enjoy a lot of benefits of having them manufacture all our stuff. We're used to getting all of our household goods now from 12,000 miles away. They're made in China. You know, everything from frying pans to underpants. What's going to happen if those supply lines to China are interrupted? You know, what might happen if we have a contest with the Republic of China over the remaining oil in the Middle East and Central Asia? Is Walmart going to continue to, you know, get the steady stream of everything from toilet seats to fishing rods from Chinese factories? In North America, I think that we're going to have to downsize and downscale everything we do. Everything from farming to education to the way we deploy ourselves in living in the landscape, sports. You know, everything that we do is going to have to be made smaller. The age of the 3,000-mile Caesar salad is coming to an end. We're going to have to grow more food closer to where we live around our towns.
Not only will food prices skyrocket, but the ability of the North American continent to produce food will diminish rapidly. The so-called Green Revolution, which took place in the 40s and 50s, saw an incredible explosion in the amount of food produced on the North American continent. Soil degradation has effectively rendered much of our agricultural land to be nothing more than a sponge onto which we pour petroleum-based chemicals to grow food. Not only are all fertilizers made out of natural gas, all commercial pesticides are made from petroleum. Not to mention the energy that's used in planting, harvesting, pumping the water for irrigation, packaging the food, processing the food, transporting the food, etc.
There's really going to be an end to that. And when it ends, we're going to be in real trouble. You know, it's not going to be just a matter of not being able to drive to the mall. It's going to be a matter of not knowing how you're going to feed your children.
In the U.S. and North America, we consume 10 calories of hydrocarbon energy for every calorie of food we eat, not counting transportation and cooking. That's an enormous, out-of-balance equation.
A lot of people, I think, are going to be engaged in the production of food in ways that they can't imagine right now. Farming is liable to become a lot more labor-intensive in the years ahead, meaning, you know, a lot more people are going to have to work at it. How are people going to get to their work? What kind of work is there going to be? Who's actually going to do the real work of creating things of value? Especially when we can't get toilet seats from China anymore. In the United States, we have a railroad system that the Bulgarians would be ashamed of. You know, we desperately are going to need railroad transport for moving people around, for moving goods around. And we don't have that. What we do have is a trucking system which is probably going to become increasingly dysfunctional, especially as the expense mounts of maintaining the tremendous interstate highway system, which costs so much money every year to maintain at what the engineers call a high level of service. which means that the trucks that are delivering things from the Central Valley of California to Toronto don't break their axles while they're bringing those Caesar salads to Toronto. Once you have a certain number of trucks that are breaking their axles in that 3,000-mile journey, that's the end of transcontinental trucking, which also implies that's the end of certain economic relationships that we've gotten used to. The Walmarts of North America have very efficiently and effectively destroyed almost every local and regional network of economic commercial interdependency, and those networks are going to have to be rebuilt. We're going to have to learn how to do retail again on the local level, and we're not prepared for that, and it's a tremendous, awesome project.
Those who've been born in or moved to suburbia tend to feel that there's a birthright to the lifestyle they enjoy. There's the 3-car garage, the large lawn, the even larger house. Consumption of resources is just something you take for granted and you pay a bill for monthly. That will change, and that will be a jarring change when it comes. It will feel like an ambush.
Suburbia has very poor prospects for the future. But unfortunately, so many generations of Americans are now used to it, and it has become so normal that there's going to be a tremendous struggle to maintain it against all the terrible events that are coming down at us. And I think what you'll see is an attempt in North America to maintain the entitlements of suburbia long after the world has made it clear that you just simply can't continue living that way.
Oil depletion and the price of oil increase will have a devastating effect on those communities, which will translate into political upheavals, because I think because it is people in these sprawling suburbs who carry a disproportionate weight in American elections. This will create tremendous pressure on politicians to solve the problem somehow by procuring more petroleum some way. I don't think there's a solution to this, but it will create tremendous stress on the political system.
I think that Americans will elect maniacs who promise to allow them to keep their McMansions and their housing and their commutes and their suburbs and their big box stores, no matter what what historical events have to say about it. And that's going to produce a lot of political friction. I think probably a lot of violence, probably a threat to our democratic institutions, and it will call into question whether or not we can continue this project of civilization in the context of a democratic republic. I'm not saying that there's going to be a dark age, but I do see a lot of potential for darkness. There's going to be a great scramble out there to get out of the suburbs. There's going to be a sort of fight over the table scraps of the 20th century out there. There's no combination of so-called alternative fuels that are going to allow us to run what we're running in the United States the way we're running it now on oil and natural gas. No amount of solar or wind or even nuclear is going to allow us to continue living this way of life. Now, a lot of people think that hydrogen is going to rescue us, and I think hydrogen is an interesting example of a kind of a public delusion, the kind of delusion that arises when people start to feel frightened. And they have reason to be frightened because we don't have a plan B.
People need to ask very serious questions about alternative energy before jumping into a lifeboat that they have no idea whether it's going to float or not. And we see a whole bunch of almost hysterical applause for hydrogen. Hydrogen is a joke. It is a myth. We will not have a hydrogen economy. Hydrogen is not a form of energy. It's a form of energy storage. And all hydrogen now is produced from some other substance which requires the input of energy.
Generally, it takes more energy to make hydrogen than you get from the hydrogen.
It's fabulous because you only have to have electricity and water. Well, to have electricity, you have to have some other form of energy. The single easiest way to create hydrogen is using methane. Methane is just a scientific term for natural gas. So in a world that we're short of natural gas, the last thing we need is a brand new user.
Hydrogen is tremendously problematical as an element. It's very hard to transport it.
Advocates of compressed hydrogen say, well, I can get a 300-mile range on a car with 190 gallons of compressed hydrogen in a vehicle. I say, great. Who's going to do the crash tests on that? And as you think these problems through, we've been doing it from the wilderness, you see that there is nothing, there is no combination of anything that will allow planet Earth to continue consuming the way it does and go on our merry way.
There are no easy or quick fixes for our oil dependency. There are no affordable, scalable alternatives. Yet the political will to address oil depletion does not yet exist. We do have one surplus, and that is a surplus of ideas about how to meet the challenges of living with less oil. Some of those ideas are coming from a movement called New Urbanism. It advocates, quite simply, a return to more traditional, walkable communities.
The New Urbanism was a reform movement in town planning and civic design and architecture that started in the late 80s among a group of young architects and planners who realized that we were reaching a dead end with the suburbanization of America, and they sort of looked back on history and the way human beings had done things in the past, and they concluded that there was a great deal of benefit for us in relearning the principles of town planning that had been thrown in the garbage since World War II by the traffic engineers and all the people who have been putting together our everyday world.
Ironically, New Urbanists have been now criticized heavily for being historicist and Back to the Future and all the rest of that, and I don't think that's at all the case. I mean, you have to pick up the threads of culture and history and carry them forward, but carrying them forward is the challenge of New Urbanism. That's the new in New Urbanism.
First, we have to just revive the idea that the town and the neighborhood and the city can be a wonderful place. And I think the New Urbanists have been very successful in beginning that process.
Everybody votes against sprawl. They hate strips and subdivisions and all the rest of the garbage that we build. And they love their historic main streets and older neighborhoods that are more diverse and more human scale.
The cultural inertia is tremendous. The home builders have certain ways of delivering their product in a cul-de-sac subdivision of McHouses. And they're used to it. They know exactly how to do it. It's still working for them, and they don't want to change.
I actually think the trend, especially in housing, is pretty clearly away from traditional subdivisions when people are given a choice. We designed this project in Denver called Stapleton. Stapleton's been redeveloped along New Urbanist lines, and it now sells at a premium of about 25% compared to typical subdivisions in the same region. What that demonstrates to me is that the marketplace really wants more walkable and more diverse neighborhoods.
Pretty soon, because of the oil situation in the world, the new urbanism will be the only urbanism. Circumstances are going to compel us to live differently in North America, whether we like SUVs or not.
I think it's more important to rest the alternative strategies on the multiplicity of implications rather than trying to be reductionist here and say this is an energy issue. Maybe the global warming issue is yet another one to address in rethinking our patterns of development. There should be, and there are, a million good reasons for good urbanism.
Most of the optimistic ideas about repairing suburbia kind of revolve around fixing up the shopping centers and turning them into mixed-use places where people can live and work and buy stuff. And in other words, turning what were single-use places into true urban villages.
The thing about sprawl is you've got all these big arterial roads that are oversized, and they've got all this strip development on the edges, which is basically underutilized land. One-story buildings with big surface parking lots. So you have these huge ribbons, which are also perfectly located for transit, and then allow high-density development to redevelop those corridors. You can completely reconstruct that strip because nobody's in love with the strip. And all of a sudden, those neighborhoods have something to plug into, to walk to. And all of a sudden, there's urban environments that young people and older people who don't want yards can live in.
I myself am a little pessimistic about the kind of resources that we're going to have available to do that. You know, we're actually now leaving behind this tremendously affluent period when we had all this great wealth. We're now entering a period when we're going to just have less money and less ability to invest in the future. So I think that what we're going to see is a lot more kind of provisional, impromptu kind of behavior. You know, people sort of making do the best they can with the remnants of what remains. The suburbs that were really built after the 1960s, the ones that are really past the inner rings, are going to become pretty deeply dysfunctional. We may see, more than one family living in a McMansion, and we may see them growing crops on what used to be the front lawn. But I think that they'll basically be the slums of the future. I think we're going to see a meltdown in the value of this living arrangement that we've created in North America. This tremendous infrastructure for daily life that is not going to function very well in a world that doesn't have cheap fossil fuel.
Great crises, by definition, are problems that got ignored until they were enormous problems. And I think we have a great crisis coming in energy. What I'm most worried about is how long we've left even addressing the issue. And the longer we ignore the issue, the more painful the problem will become.
The crux of the issue, I think, for most ordinary people is we're going to have to live more locally. And we're going to have to at least prepare mentally to do that. Ask yourself, what kind of job am I going to have in 10 years? I'm thinking about that myself. I'm an author, but I depend on the trade publishing industry to do my thing. The trade publishing industry might not exist in 10 years the way it has been. It's occurred to me that I would start a local newspaper.
Luckily, technology has really allowed a lot of people, if they wanted to probably work at home.
Find a way to live with fewer car trips, with less driving, becoming less car dependent if you possibly can, because believe me, we're going to have to do that in the future.
Start paying attention to how you use energy. Pay attention to the fact that energy costs were too cheap, and they need to be a lot more expensive.
One of the most common themes that I've heard, which I really think would be a good outcome of peak oil, is that I'm 52, my parents were raised in the Depression, is that there was a strong sense of neighborhood and a sense of community, that there was a sense of local place that will be an inevitable outcome of peak oil, with a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth and a lot of tantrum throwing. But I think people will learn how to become neighbors again. That may be a good thing for suburbia.
What we will end up doing is creating a lot more localized creation of energy sources, so that if you have an energy problem, it's the problem for your village versus the problem for 1/3 of the United States.
Alternative energies are going to be, at best, small lifeboats made available in local communities by people who say, nobody's going to do this for me. We have to do it for ourselves. We have to get solar in our neighborhood to wire our apartment. Right now, we have to spend whatever it takes because the grid's going to go down. We have to find ways to create biodiesel in our own community. This peak oil is going to reverse globalization. Survival will happen from a local basis, and we're going to see local economies. That's the only way the human race is going to survive.
2 or 3 centuries from now, people will be looking back and formulating myths about the way people lived back then in that. Whether they'll look at it as a lost golden age or an age of horrors and insanity, I'm not sure. I think it may be the latter. They'll look back on us and they'll say, my God, who were those people? How could they be so stupid?
20 years from now, there will still be oil in the ground. 200 years from now, somebody somewhere will still be pumping it. But soon, within our lifetimes, the growing energy demands of the American dream here in suburbia will eclipse our planet's ability to provide it. Will we learn to dream of something better for the world to come?